I first met Jerry about 4 years back at Wharton, and I can probably sort of just give a very simple idea that every time I have had a discussion with Jerry and met with Jerry, I have come up sort of learning something new, and just somehow there is some interaction. The I don't know as to what it is. It's very difficult for me to really explain this in words, but there is something which inspires you to really think different. So it's my great privilege to introduce Professor Jerry Wind. He joined Wharton in 1967 and is currently the Lauder Professor Emeritus and Professor of Marketing at Wharton. He also founded the Wharton think tank, and in 2017, he was also inducted in the Marketing Hall of Fame. So with that, let me hand over the mic to Jerry. Thank you very much, everyone, again for joining in. Welcome, Jerry.
Thanks, Sudan. Thanks for this nice introduction, and congratulations on your initiative. I think what you're doing with the Udan Trust is absolutely wonderful and really something needed. So I really hope that everyone on the call will listen and contribute to these wonderful activities. What I would like to do is discuss with you the theme of transformation in times of crisis and post-crisis, or at least part of the crisis we say we are facing has been resolved or is being resolved. Unfortunately, not so much in India and other parts of the world, but at least in the US, it's kind of, we seem to be at the end of this. What I would like to do is to share with you some of the findings we had in our book that was just published, Transformation in Times of Crisis, and suggest what are the opportunities we face, especially now when at least we could start seeing the light at the end of the tunnel in some countries of the reopening the economy. But at the same time, we continue to have increased demand for social justice and other crises that face society, like the climate crisis, or especially in the US, a huge crisis of the ideological divide. We did succeed in dealing effectively with the pandemic in the last 16 months or so. And the question that I would like us to start with is, what have we learned? And I think we've learned a lot in the last 16 months that should help us in navigating our way toward capitalizing on the opportunities the crisis offers. So think about that over 4 billion people worldwide stayed at home, and work from home became the norm for so many companies, so many individuals. Given the success, it's kind of hard to imagine a situation where now, after the crisis, people will just go back to their old habits and go back to work without coming with some type of a hybrid solution of work from home and work from the place of work. We've seen a shift to online learning by all schools and universities. And again, it's hard to imagine that universities will go back just to traditional classroom and not try to leverage the learning they've had. And we can start expecting to see development such as flipped classroom 2.0, 3.0, and beyond. We've seen closing of both retail establishments and the huge shift to e-commerce. The estimates have been that in the first 3 months of the pandemic of last year, the progress that has been made in e-commerce would have taken like 10 years before the pandemic. Social distancing became the norm. Hopefully we won't need it in the future once everyone is vaccinated. The area of digital relationship and communication is upon us. Just look at the Zoom that we're now experiencing, and one would expect that in the future, many of the same digital communication, including even selling and negotiation, will continue. So disruption of air travel, while it was almost complete for a while, will never go back to the old way because of the impact of the digital experience we've had. There have been disruption in global supply chain that are leading to rethinking supply chains. There have been massive unemployment, and I think this will actually strengthen one of the trends we're going to talk about, which is open talent. And there have been closing and partial and restricted opening of all cultural institutions, sports, and other public events, which have led many of them to initiate new digital experiences and engaging customers digitally. And suddenly they realize that their reach is not only locally, it's not only a museum in a given city, but by expanding their offering digitally, they can reach audiences globally. So it has really led to fundamental change in the scope of many of these organizations. Demand for social justice and aftermath of the killing of George Floyd continues, and we'll see increased demand for equality and justice. There's increased concern about climate change. There's unprecedented collaboration among competitors that led to the speedy development of vaccines and hopefully will lead to greater collaborations among companies across countries. And the disturbing fact, the reluctance of so many to be vaccinated, which places a huge challenge to all societies of how to deal with this. So these are some of the lessons we have learned in the last few, 16 months or so. So our premise is that, especially given the crisis and these lessons, that we face enormous opportunities. The word crisis, as you probably all know, composed of two characters in Chinese, danger and opportunities. And Winston Churchill is believed to have said, never let a good crisis go to waste. So that's our theme here. We would like not to waste the crisis we went through and the lessons. I would like to discuss with you what are the implications of the crisis and the lessons we had and what have we to do now. So primarily, I see here three key areas of attention. One is coping and surviving the triple crisis. And still, the pandemic is still, a major problem in India and other countries. And we still have to deal with this, but we have to deal also with the other related crises we have. The second aspect is how do we capture the opportunities the crisis offers? And that's where the focus of my discussion is going to be, even though it's obviously will have some implication to what you can do now in kind of the first area. And the third is how to anticipate and prepare for the next crisis, which I think is an important consideration for everyone once we address the first two issues. So the objective of our session is to encourage and inspire you to create opportunities that are offered by the crisis and the lessons we have from dealing with this, and to realize that we cannot just go back to life as we knew before the start of the crisis. Our approach in the session is to propose 8 principles to capture opportunities in time of crisis. These are the 8 principles in the book. And I will try to do it actually pretty fast to allow a lot of time to Q&A and discussion, and ideally to be able to identify potential experiments that one can take to try to implement some of the ideas we're going to discuss. And we'll devote most of our time actually to this discussion. It's going to be an interactive session. And the reason for this is in events like this, it's nice, you may want to double task, your head, yeah, it makes sense. You're really not gaining much from this unless you will try to apply the ideas, unless you'll try to implement it. And there's no better way of implementing than designing experiments to try to do it. The value of experimentation is that typically you design it with a control group, so it allows you to come up with causal link between what you're doing and the results that you're getting. Typically, you don't want to experiment with trivial variation around what you do. So it will enhance innovation and coming up with more innovative ideas. And it will create an amazing corporate culture that enhances innovation. There is nothing better than experimentation and creating, insisting on experimentation throughout the operation to attract the right type of talent and create an energy in the organization that's centered around innovation. It also forces you to measure the results of what you're doing. You cannot do experiments unless you are coming up with specific measures. So, what I really would hope we'll get out of the session is some inspiration from the first part of the discussion and then a rich discussion centered around so, what can we do with some of these ideas? And at the end, I'll take the last few minutes to ask you to reflect and identify what is the takeaway that you can take away from the session as you move forward. So let's start with the principles that we propose as guideline for capturing opportunities in times of crisis and beyond. The first one is the challenging and changing your mental models. The mental model, which is, let's just go back to work the way it was before. A lot of companies even calling this get back to work. I think it's the wrong mental model. We cannot just go back to the world pre-March of last year. The world has changed, as we discussed before when we reviewed the lessons that we had. When you have work from home, when you have the communication via Zoom and other digital devices, when you have e-commerce dominant, when you have e-learning, telemedicine and the like, you cannot just ignore the experience we had with this and go back. You have to rethink the new reality. We are facing a new reality. And keep in mind that all of the really successful companies, the Google, the Microsoft, the Amazon, all of them continuously experiment. They're running thousands of experiments. Every single decision they make is based on results of experimentation. So start thinking about experimentation with new type of mental models. And when you think about the real disruptive companies, think about Uber, for example, Airbnb. What have they done? All of these disruptive companies challenged and changed the mental model of their industry. So the first task and the most fundamental that I would like you to explore is, what is your mental model? Is it still appropriate for today's environment, for the new reality? And how can you change it? What will be the needed changes to the mental model? That how can you become not only a defensive player, but actually a disruptor in your industry? So point one, let's think about your mental models. How can you challenge them? And how can you change them to try to capitalize on the opportunities facing us? The second principle and suggestion is to reimagine and to reinvent your approach to the customers and to the stakeholders. So there are two components here. Customer centricity has been argued for years. There's nothing new about this. But the customers are changing continuously. The customers are much more empowered. They're much more skeptical. And as a result of the crisis, also a lot of the studies in the last few years, the last year and a half or so, show that they're very uncertain. But at the same time, they're all considering kind of basically almost to re-examine their life, to re-examine what they're doing. Is this really the right thing? Should they really continue doing, kind of what they have been doing before? And there is the changes in technology that we envision and kind of experience all the time. The shift to cloud, to mobile, the regular use of apps, the advances in AI, including emotional AI, are such that they're really enriching and allowing the consumers to be much more empowered in the balance of the relationship between the consumer and the retailer or the manufacturer or kind of the firm in general. So the point one here is really, we have to take really seriously the consumer and design all our strategies starting with the consumer. What are their needs, expectations? How are they changing? What are kind of the evolving needs and expectations of the consumers? And even think about how can we start benefiting for co-creating experiences and with the customer. So as opposed to we doing everything and sending it to them, how can we co-create the experience with them? How can we create a platform that allows them to customize the product the way they want it? Because one of the things we know, for example, about consumers is that they are all looking in today's environment for real-time customized experience. They're really looking for a real-time personalized experiences. How can we provide it for them? What are the implications? At the same time, there is a major shift in society in the move away from the traditional shareholder orientation to a stakeholder orientation. And the stakeholder orientation, it's a significant shift. It's kind of a reaction to some of the ills of society and realizing that a firm, any organization, should really address the needs and evolving needs of all their stakeholders, their customers predominantly, but also their employees, their partners, the shareholders being one of them. And very important is having a positive social impact on society. And that's what have led recently to a lot of focus on a purpose-led organizations and asking what is the purpose that drives the organization. And so whatever you're doing, think about the doing good for society is not just a philanthropic activity, but how do you integrate it as part of your activities? And the example of the B corporation that are moving this area is really a great example for companies that are focusing on this. The third principle that I would like to suggest is really divided, includes three components here. The one is the importance of speed. And speed is really critical in today's environment. The changes are so rapid that you cannot just take the kind of the time and the traditional approach of analysis and then designing a strategy and moving forward. You really have to design a much more rapid, agile system and approach that will allow you to respond much faster to the changes in the environment. The second component here is the speed has to be with respect to everything you do, but especially digital transformation. And those organizations that had the right digital infrastructure were able to respond much faster and much more effectively during the crisis to the need to change and engage the audiences digitally than those who did not. In the cultural institution area, for example, an organization such as the Barnes Foundation had a much better digital infrastructure than the Philadelphia Museum of Art. As a result, they were able to engage audiences from day one, attract new audiences globally, improve even their fundraising at a time that the Philadelphia Museum of Art was very, very slow in moving and responding and trying to engage their customers. And the same applies to any organizations. And the third component here is as we design the new system, as we transform ourselves, how can we do it in a way that we can personalize our offering at scale? I mentioned before we talk about the consumer that one of the things consumer want today is real-time personalized experience. So the question is, how do we move away from the one-size-fits-all to developing platforms that the digital transformation allowing us to do that allow personalization at scale, addressing consumer needs. The fourth area is the reinvent your talent strategy and embrace open innovation and open talent. The key to this is that the value and benefits of open innovation and open talent has been proven. There are a number of factors contributing to this. Number one is increasing number of people do not want to work for companies. That's what's called the gig economy. And the gig economy is increasing significantly. It's estimated that it's close to 1/3 of all the workforce in the US, and it's growing. Some of the projections suggesting that in a few years it will approach almost like 50% of the workforce that does not want to work for companies. Second, and very important, is the fact that many of the challenges you face may have already been solved somewhere else in the world. So as opposed to trying to just kind of struggle and try to develop it from scratch, let's try to find, kind of the solutions that exist already somewhere else in the world. There have been a number of recent studies that suggest that the value of open innovation compared to doing the same job internally with internal talent is quite amazing. The data suggests that we have 4 to 5x, 4 to 5 times the speed of achieving the solution, and we have 8 to 10x the cost savings compared to doing it internally. And major companies, if you think about NASA, kind of NASA probably does not have that much of a problem of attracting the talent they want compared to most other companies, because it's a much more exotic and exciting company to work for. But even NASA, that has 17,000 employees, use extensively open innovation. So whenever they have a challenge that they cannot solve internally, they set it out as a challenge to the world. And they have, when you look at the organizational structure of NASA, it's in a sense the 17,000 employees, but close to 1 million participants in the open innovation talents that they have, the network of talent that they can attract. So open innovation is a real breakthrough. And when you think about this, some of the most talented people are not necessarily the ones that are likely to work for your company. If you think about software development as an example, average software developer is the type of person that you probably can attract to your firm. But the difference in productivity between the average software developer and the extreme talent, the top talent in this area, is well documented to be 10x. Imagine the difference when you're accessing through open innovation and open talent, the 10x capability compared to what you can hire internally. And a key factor, you're paying only for the results. So if you're establishing an open competition, you're paying only for the one that came up with the results, as opposed to paying for all the efforts to try to get there. That's the reason that most pharmaceutical companies, most companies are moving toward using open innovation. That's the reason that there are aggregators, companies like Topcoder or Innocentive, that have over 1 million independent gig economy inventors part of their network, and they can help you access them. The other rationale behind open innovation, open talent, is that it's well known that most problems require an interdisciplinary perspective. And actually, Innocentive ran a study a few years back and tried to find out how come they're so successful. And they found out they were successful because the open innovation approach attracts people from different disciplines. And when you set up a challenge, the people who solve the challenge are typically from other disciplines and not the core discipline you are. So for example, if Eli Lilly, which is a frequent user of open innovation, set up a medical challenge out there, many times the solutions are coming from people from outside the medical field. In fact, recently there was a challenge given by Merck, and the solution to this medical problem was solved by 3 computer scientists from MIT. So again, showing you the fact of the value of external perspective. And the domain of open innovation applies not only in the software development area, but in all domains, every activity you're doing. So there was a company a few years ago started, like Victor and Spoils, that had, for example, over 7,000 creatives. It's an advertising agency. And when you had an advertising challenge, you send it to the creatives, and you used to get like hundreds of responses. And if you've seen the commercials for Harley Davidson of no cages, this is an example of one of the ads that were developed through open innovation. So the implication for the talent strategy of the organization is, as opposed to just saying, okay, what talent do I have to hire? It's basically saying, what talent can I get from the outside, from the open talent world and open innovation? And what are the implications of the type of competencies that I need internally? Perhaps I need more designers and integrators, but actually the actual work to have done outside by open innovation. The fifth area is to seize the needs for speed, which we talked about before, and design for agility, adjacencies, and adaptability. And the idea here is speed and agility are really critical. And in order to start it, let's start thinking primarily about the adjacencies, whether adjacencies in terms of the products and services we're currently offering, or the markets we serve, or the business models we have, or the partners we have, the networks we have, and then how do we design then kind of our system to be able to adapt to this in an effective way. So a pretty classic way of trying to speed and start right away. So the low-hanging fruits that we typically will have in the adjacencies as opposed to something else. But the key to everything we're dealing with, especially in today's environment, is the need to continuously innovate and then to experiment. We talked at the beginning about the need for experimentation and the benefit of experimentation. We'll focus on this in our discussion. But the need for innovation is really critical. The world is changing. Technology is changing. Consumers are changing. Distribution systems are changing. The ways of reaching the consumers are changing. The competition is changing. And keep in mind that competition is typically from outside. The serious competition typically will come from outside your industry. And from a consumer point of view, consumers don't think in terms of verticals. They don't think in terms of now basically what is my retail experience and who am I competing in the retail area. Consumer experiences across industries. So the consumers that experience the wonderful tracking of every Federal Express package expect it now from everyone, not only when they're dealing with Federal Express. When you're thinking about innovation, you really have to think about innovation of everything that you do, your offering, your business model, your approach to market. And the innovation should actually be both innovation in big I and little I in terms of trying to think about really breakthrough innovation as opposed to incremental continuous improvement that you're dealing with. And the way to do it is by moving toward continuous experimentation, creating this culture of experimentation. Let's come up with new ideas and start experimenting with them. The next area actually help elaborate a little bit on the range of innovations that we can experiment with. And the idea here is to think about a portfolio of initiative along the full horizons, kind of innovation horizons we know. Typically, there are 3 innovation horizons. Think about this in 2 dimensions. Each innovation horizon is one, the product and service offering that we have, the business models we have, the technology we offer, everything we're offering the consumer. At the second dimension, think in terms of the markets we serve. Now, in each one of them, the product, service offering, business model, technology offering, think about, and the market, think about what we currently do, things that exist in the world and we do not serve, and then new to the world. And the idea will be that in your portfolio of experiments and initiatives should include elements in all 3 areas. So you should have things that relate to what we currently do and current markets we serve, and how do we experiment there to do them better and address the kind of evolving need of customers in this area. How do we design set of experiments in the second innovation horizon, things that others are doing, others perhaps in other industries, and don't look only at your industry. The best benchmarking is across industries and not within industry. And also look at kind of other customer segments that you do not reach today and you would like to reach. What can you do with them? And then in the third area, think about new to the world, product solution, service solution, business models, as well as new markets. Now, ideally, what you like to do is would like to have experiments in all three. You may divide the resource allocation, obviously maybe something like 80% in the current Horizon 1, but 20% allocated between Horizon 2 or 3. If you feel that this is too much and you have to focus more on the current, I think the most you can do is don't allocate more than 90% to the current, and at least allocate 10% between Horizon 2 and 3. Think about an example, kind of a compelling example, Tesla. Tesla has current offering both in the electric car and the battery markets they're in, Horizon 1. But they're improving it by trying to, within Horizon 1, they're moving, for example, lower in the price range and introduce the Model 3, much cheaper than the Model S, and they're doing other things to reach within Horizon 1. But at the same time, they're already at Horizon 2 with the movement toward the autonomous car. And then there are also in the activities in Horizon 3 with their activities of the satellite operation they have, and with even the radical idea of a tube type communication between cities, between LA and San Francisco, you kind of tube type transportation. So how do you design, each of you, how do you design your portfolio of initiatives and experiments to capture all three innovation horizons? The final area I would like to kind of suggest is deploying idealized design, and starting actually with a compelling vision for the organization. What type of organization would you like to have in 2030? What would you like the legacy of the organization to be? So the more you can start thinking about a compelling vision, and think about one that I love is the one that Kroger developed, which is zero hunger, zero waste. Think about how powerful this vision is. It addresses both the needs of society, zero hunger in the communities they serve, but at the same time also give an amazing direction internally in terms of how do you lead to zero waste in our activities. And they have it very operational. They have it basically, they're trying to achieve the zero hunger, zero waste by 2025. They have measures against it, and they're reporting on an ongoing basis how they're doing against it. So start with a vision, compelling vision. What is your vision for your organization? And then let's go to our idealized design. As opposed to the traditional planning, which is see where you are and start moving forward with this, ask yourself the question, if I'm trying to achieve, let's say the zero hunger, zero waste, or whatever your vision will be, what do I have to do now to try to get there? So in a sense, it's called backward planning. Plan backward from this ideal that you have. A simple way of implementing idealized design is select a date that you are interested in achieving some ideal objective, let's say 2030. Select a prize. What award would you like to get? To be the most innovative retailer, to be the best place to work for. You select the award that you want to get. And then write a story for receiving the award. Why did you get the award? By doing this very simple three things, deciding what is the time period, what is the award you want to get, and explain how you got it. This is almost a foundation of an idealized design planning process that will allow you to identify, what do you have to do now to try to get toward this ideal. And then once you do it, then recreate your organizational architecture. Organizational architecture includes your corporate culture, the processes that you have, the structure that you have, the competencies that you have, both internally and that you can get access to through open innovation. It includes the technology. It includes the performance measures and incentive that you have. It includes all the things that constitute an organization. And then once you do it, you also have to think about the ecosystem that you have, the networks that you have. And how do you orchestrate the various participants in your network? Once you do it, I think you will be able to implement a lot of the ideas we discussed here. And the way to implement them is then starting by identifying specific experiments that you want to start running, leveraging some of the ideas we discussed in the previous principles here. Um, Key to this, the whole area of the idealized design is moving away from just, okay, how do we do a little tweaking and changing what we currently have, but starting asking the question, if I want to achieve, reach the moon, the objective that Kennedy had of how do we reach the moon, what is the ideal? What would you like to be your legacy? What do you really will feel really great about if you accomplish this in the time period that you're interested in, whether it's a 3-year, 5-year, 2030? Uh, and then say, what do I have to do today to try to get there through the strategy, which hopefully will be through a series of experimentation? But what do I need in terms of organizational architecture that facilitates, would allow me to do it and achieve it in kind of in the most effective way? Um, if we do it, I believe you'll be able to succeed in capturing the opportunities the crisis offered, the lessons we just discussed, and being able to thrive and not only survive in this environment. So if you look at what we just covered, we covered 8 areas. And let me pause here and respond to any questions you may have. And once we address the questions or comments that you may have on this, what I would love us to do is to start focusing on what can we do in terms of designing specific experiments that will allow us to leverage these ideas in moving us forward.
Thank you so much, Jerry. That was wonderful. We are getting questions. I'll just sort of keep on sort of reading these as we come. I mean, probably for each one of these principles, Jerry. The first one is regarding change your mental model. And the question that I have gotten is, you make a great point about challenging and changing the existing mental models. What are the biggest impediments, Jerry, that you have seen organizations struggle with to be able to even challenge and, of course, change the mental model? What are the biggest challenges that they face?
Well, it's a great question. Probably will vary from one organization to another,
Mhm.
from one individual to another. I think the biggest obstacle that I see is the convenience, the comfort of the status quo. And in today's environment, actually, because of the crisis, people realize the status, you cannot just continue the status quo as it was before. So it's a little bit of a panic and fear to try to deal with the unknown. And I think that's what will differentiate between the really successful companies and those who are not. And unfortunately, there are so many companies that fail. Kind of, I've seen recent statistics that among major retailers, there were like over 120 bankruptcies in the recent period. And if you look at this in a bigger picture, think about the Fortune 500 firms that were on the list at 2000. Over close to 50% of them are no longer on the list today. So the fear primarily of taking new initiative, of moving away from what you feel comfortable with, is probably the major obstacle.
Great point, Jerry. On the same thing, as you were mentioning, I mean, just maybe a more of an extension from my side, is the pandemic very clearly has maybe shifted the landscape quite a bit, right? And in many cases, you are right that we shouldn't talk about as to how can we change what we were doing earlier. We have to really sort of chart a completely new vision moving forward, right? Now, you talk also about the organizational architecture, wherein I think the cultures, values, and that they have been sort of built over time. How difficult or easy it is for specifically a large organization, which let us say has been around for about 50 years or 100 years, to really be able to do that. And because, I mean, let us say someone with an organization with 100,000 people who really are spread across maybe 50 countries. and who really have built their culture over the last 100 years, one step at a time. Suddenly, because of the pandemic, that landscape or the ground on which the entire business was built has probably shifted quite a bit. How exactly can the organizational architecture be even thought of given the complexities that we are talking about in terms of culture, etc.?
Great question. Let me suggest three things. One is that you find a unit, a
Mm-hmm.
separate business unit, or a small country. Find somewhere that
Mm-hmm.
you are willing to experiment with, that you're not
Mm-hmm.
afraid to experiment with. And try to experiment in this specific area. Take a business unit and try to change the culture of the business unit, the processes, the structure, the reward system, the technology. Start doing it. That's one. The other one, which a lot of companies have been doing, is through merger and acquisitions. You start acquiring companies that augment the capabilities. Now, since you're focusing primarily on retail,
Mm-hmm.
um, the reality is that all companies have to move into becoming omni-channel.
Mm-hmm.
No online alone can survive. No physical facilities alone can survive. You
Mm-hmm.
have to be an omni-channel. And I think if there's anything, the last pandemic, 16 months, prove it that unless you had a solid online operation, you cannot survive.
Mm-hmm.
So you need the integration of the two. So look acquisitions. So Amazon acquired Whole Foods, kind of a
Mm-hmm.
premier, retailer to start building the experience that they need of becoming omni-channel in everything they do.
Mm-hmm.
Look at Walmart. Walmart acquires endless number of companies in the online space, kind of primarily to try to build their competencies in this area. And I think they're a great example for a very large company that is moving effectively toward omni-channel through the acquisition areas by and selecting as the head of their of digital operations one of the CEOs of the companies they acquired.
Mm-hmm.
uh, the third area, so one, you can do it by identifying a unit internally and do it. Second, acquisition, merger and acquisition, especially even reverse merger to some extent,
Yeah.
uh, uh, in terms of the expertise that the two companies bring to each other. And the third is by bringing new talent, kind of to the organization, kind of one of the biggest changes, bring a new chief operating officer, create
Mm-hmm.
bring a new president to one of your business units and giving them the freedom to do it.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge by doing it is making sure that the old organizational culture and processes are not constraining and killing kind of the new entry. Give them the freedom, empower them to try to do it. I think we'll use any one of these three or all three of these. I think even a large organization will easily be able to deal with this.
Thank you, Jerry. Very, very helpful. Another question that we have gotten, I mean, so do smaller organizations and startups, based on, I think, the complexity you're talking about, do they have an inherent advantage compared to larger organizations where things are more established and preset?
Well, they have advantage in some respects. They have an advantage. Obviously, they don't have the constraint of the past,
Yeah.
so they can create something. They have a fresh canvas they can paint on. They don't have
Mm-hmm.
to deal with all the
Mm-hmm.
previous constraints. The problem they have, the disadvantage they have, they don't have the access to the markets. They may not have the capital that they kind of the large
Mm-hmm.
companies have. They don't have the established brand name that the large companies have. So that's one of the reasons that I think a collaboration of the two is the most powerful one. And that's the reason you see that increasing number of large companies, established companies, are establishing accelerators
Mm-hmm.
to try to attract. The accelerator is really a magnet on a given topic that attracts all the startup who work in this given area to work
Mm-hmm.
with them, and then they can decide which of them they want to acquire or how do they want to support them. But it's primarily they have a way, kind of a foothold in the future with this.
Mm-hmm.
And from the startup point of view, it's ideal to come up with a partner, if you want to, or a base in a large company that gives them opportunity to experiment and interact with an established client base, with the infrastructure that they have and the like. So I think the winning combination is really the one that brings the two together. And from a legacy point of view, I would suggest for the legacy companies to seriously think about establishing accelerators on specific topics that will attract the startup. And think about any area, how many there are thousands of startups in the fintech area, or in my area, education. Think about the kind of the ed tech, how many new ed tech companies are there? And we have, and the legacy companies don't have a choice. They really cannot, and it's a type of open innovation. They cannot really expect to develop all the knowledge in-house. It will take them forever, and they'll have tons of resistance, and most likely they will not be successful. So why not try to leverage existing talent and the entrepreneurial and initiative of the startup and bring them together?
Fantastic, Jerry. I mean, I can't help but asking this on the ed tech part, because I know we have professors joining from India, we have academics joining in from Stockholm and so on. So one question is, I mean, education, I think, has been on the forefront, right? Because everyone knows and everyone expects education to get disrupted, right? I mean, so you are really looking at joining let us say a college, spending probably about $70,000 or $80,000 a year, versus probably getting the same level of education, this thing. So what is your perspective? I mean, how do you really see the entire, maybe college education, just to start with, getting disrupted over the next many years?
I think those educational institutions that are basically on the theme or the mental model that says, let's just go back to the wonderful old days before the crisis, they're doomed. They will not succeed. If they're among the top 20 universities in the world, they probably will succeed because their attraction is the brand name and the network of alumni that they have, and not necessarily the educational content. But if you're looking just at educational content, there is no way that any university will just go back to the traditional classroom will succeed. Flipped classroom is here to stay. Flipped classroom, get primarily leveraging then the technology. You can learn on your own. Why sit in a classroom and listen to a lecture? Do it on your own. That can be personalized at your own speed, and then use the class time as a way to apply the knowledge and integrate this and discuss it and kind of have a real experiential learning, which is the most powerful way of learning. So in my view, all universities have to move toward a hybrid model. They have to move into some combination of online and think about creative ways of dealing with the interaction, the experiential learning. But the challenge for universities is they have to challenge all of their mental models, because everything that universities do today is not driven by the need of the learner and by the effectiveness of learning. Think about scheduling. Why are all universities scheduled semester-based 2 times a week for 80 minutes each time? Is this the best for learning? No. It is primarily the convenience of the scheduler. That's what drove university schedules. Why not come up with creative initiatives of a 5-day program, integrated program on one topic? Can be by far more effective. So there is a whole, think about every aspect of the educational process, or every aspect has to be re-examined, challenged, and ideally changed.
Very interesting. So who is asking these questions, Jerry? I mean, because I think these are difficult questions to ask. And understandably, every university has a certain set of systems, and there is a substantial amount of legacy as well, right? So someone really has to be bold. And unfortunately, I still feel that, I mean, it becomes hugely challenging for someone to really sort of step back and ask these difficult questions. So who is going to be asking these questions? We were hoping, though, that the pandemic may have acted as a bit of a, almost like a wake-up call, let us say, for a lack of better. But I mean, who is asking these questions?
I think what you'll get is it all depending on the individual. I think the answer to your actually previous question, which I probably forgot to give,
Mm-hmm.
which was the question of how do we assure changes in legacy organization, the like. There's one criteria, one critical factor, and this is the courage of the leader.
Yeah.
The courage of the leader. You need courageous and innovative leaders who can make things happen. And the leader, ideally, if you're lucky, that the leader will be the CEO of the organization. But it doesn't have to be, because it might be that the leader is the head of a business unit
Yeah.
somewhere there, a small group. And let's start innovative in the small group, and then let the rest of the organization learn from this and adapt.
Hmm. Very interesting. So one question that we have gotten, can you explain that network orchestration a little bit more? So that was, I think, one question which just sort of came in. So can you
So,
give a specific example, Jerry, which helps people to understand here?
yeah, certainly. Well, think about Uber is a great example. Uber is a disruptor. They challenged the mental model of taxi services,
Mm-hmm.
came up with a technology platform that connects the drivers and the customers. So you have a technology platform that allows the connection of the two in real time in the most convenient way. So Uber, in a sense, is a network orchestrator. They're orchestrating the combined network of the customers and the drivers. So this will be kind of a simple example. Airbnb is another example for a network orchestrator,
Mm-hmm.
by bringing together um, homeowners who have homes or apartments or rooms they want to rent,
Mm-hmm.
and the customers who have the need. And they created a platform that allowed them to bring the two together. In a previous book a few years ago, we published, it's called The Network Imperative.
Mm-hmm.
We did an analysis of four dominant business models. One of them is the business model of manufacturers, kind of for that leverage primarily the asset builders, like manufacturers or retailers. They're leveraging their assets. Second model was the model of service providers, like consulting firms.
Mm-hmm.
A third model was of of knowledge developers. This could be software developers. This could be pharmaceutical companies that are developing new patents. And the fourth category was the network orchestrators, like the Google, like the Uber and Airbnb and others, who manage primarily a network. And we looked at for these 4 miles, we looked at what has been the market cap as a multiple of revenue. And the findings were quite amazing. They were for the asset builders, the manufacturers, retailers, the multiple was 1 to 2. For the service providers, it was like 3 to 4. For the software developers, knowledge developers, it's about 5. And for the network orchestrators, it was about 8x.
Hmm.
So clearly the market rewards in terms of market cap those companies that succeed in managing networks. And also we have to think about the fact that increasingly competition today, especially if you look at the retail area, competition is not just uh, company X versus company Y. The competition is the network that each one of them have. The network going all the way to what is the supply chain that each one of them have. Think about the whole supply chain value, and think about their ability to deal with the consumers, reach the consumers through social networks and others. So it's really the ability to manage the entire network that each one of them have. So you have to evaluate not the retail company A versus B, but the network that each one of them has.
Do you think, Jerry, this network effect can also be impactful specifically on the talent strategy and how exactly you operate as a company? Because you gave the example of Uber, which is pretty much a gig company, right? And overall, Airbnb is the biggest hospitality company which doesn't have a single hotel
Right.
owned, right? So are we really looking at, is there an inspiration from those stories which can be used by leaders to rethink as to how exactly they will grow their team or expand their team and get things done?
Great point. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think every one of your listeners can benefit, if they're not using it already, can benefit by re-challenging their whole talent strategy and
Mhm.
saying, what talent do I really have to have in-house? And what talent exists out there that I can access more effectively than just by hiring people? The example I gave in terms of software development was like 10x the kind of the
Exactly.
productivity of outside. It's a no-brainer that you should not hire internally software developer. They hire the designers and hire the integrator of the software, but the software itself to be developed, do it outside. It's a no-brainer type area, and start identifying. And now everyone requires software development. Given that we are desperate for faster digital transformation. So think about the benefits in terms of time and the speed and cost of doing this externally. So I think everyone should re-examine their talent strategy very, very seriously. Keep in mind, all of the 8 principles were originally developed. We started the book about 2 years ago. And the book at the time, the title of the book was The Architecture of Disruption. It was designed as a guideline for legacy companies to defend against disruptors and become disruptors. What we did in the beginning on kind of at early March of last year, we looked at the list and I spoke with my co-author Nitin and I said, you know what? All our principles are actually perfect to try to deal with the crisis. Let's flip. So we flipped the structure of the book, but the same 8 principles. These are the principles that every legacy company has to try to adopt if they want to defend against disruptors or ideally become a disruptor.
You talked about the innovation part, right? And you talked about the different portfolios and so on, right? The Horizon 1, Horizon 2,
Yeah.
and Horizon 3. Now, understandably, you're looking at almost like a future back thinking, right? Future to present. How can you map back? Uh, do you think organizations really have, in many cases, probably the adequate amount of resources as well as maybe capability, for lack of a better word, to think Horizon 3? I mean, I can think of one, I can think of two because of the adjacencies, but what about three? Because three seems to be a little far-fetched, and in many cases, because I mean, if you really look at the average, but as a CMO, right, in the space, their average tenure is probably about 2 to 3 years, maybe 4 years at most. So from that perspective, I think do the specifically in the retail or the e-commerce industry, the industry we specialize in, do the executives even have adequate time to think about Horizon 3?
Probably not. And the way to address it will be through creating the accelerators for startups who
Mm-hmm.
are thinking about Horizon 2 and Horizon 3.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's primarily the real benefit of this, of start thinking about creating an internal accelerator that focus of, what is, if you talk about back to the educational area, what will be flipped classroom 2.0. Create basically competition, and select startups that are working in the area and bring them in to try
Yeah.
to further develop the idea. Or
Yeah.
in the retail area, think about, how do you take the idea of what Amazon has started already was basically a store with no cashiers.
Yeah.
Kind
Yeah.
of, how do you take this and really expand this further to other domains?
Mm-hmm.
In the retail area? Or how do you use augmented reality more effectively to try to engage customers? Or, you select the topic that you want to, that is something to relate to new segment or new type of behavior in Horizon 2 or 3, and try to encourage software, kind of new startups or
Mm-hmm.
go through other open innovation approaches to try to get it. But you raised another interesting question here. You talked about the CMO. So let me take a minute, if I may, and share with you my view of the role of the CMO.
Mm-hmm.
I think the changes we see now and what we just kind of discussed in terms of those 8 principles have major implication to the role of the CMO. And the statistic that you quote, which is correct, which is the life expectancy of a CMO is about 2 years, or kind of it's actually it's becoming even shorter, um, is a problem that it's a symptom of the problem that we have. No CMO has responsibility to what we teach in marketing as the traditional 4 Ps. No CMO is responsible for the product or for the price
Yeah.
or for their place, which is the distribution. And then
Hmm.
typically they have a some responsibility on the promotion or the advertising part and the brand. My view is that that's a wrong conceptualization for the role of the CMO. The CMO should actually be the person in the organization that is in charge of audience engagement and audience growth. Think about the focus on audience growth and engagement. To do it, no one can do it with a single function. You have to become the coordinator and integrator of all the different organizational silos that are leading to the delivery of the experience that the customer suggests. Like we talk about in omni-channel, we talk about a seamless experience across all channels. But to deliver the seamless experience, you need operation and service and the financing. You need all of the our kind of aspects of the organization who are delivering
Hmm.
this experience. So the CMO should be the one who is in charge of this and can coordinate the internal resources and external resources that are leading toward the engaging the customers in a deeper and more effective way. In this respect, I see a great parallel between the CMO and the CFO. The CFO is in charge of the financial viability of the organization. The parallel, the CMO should be in charge of the audience engagement
Hmm.
of the organization. And if you give the CMO this responsibility, I think you'll make a huge progress forward.
Hmm.
And in a sense, when you look at titles today of CMOs, some of the most successful companies have changed the titles and are either adding to a title to marketing and growth officer or digital officer, some combination, or even more telling, they don't have even the name marketing in the title
Yeah.
anymore. But you're dealing with chief client experience, chief client growth, or chief growth officer, chief revenue officer, all of the other things that are relating to what I'm talking about as in charge of the audience engagement without necessarily focusing on the marketing kind of aspects.
That's a great point, Jerry. That's a very, very powerful. In fact, I was sitting in a panel where the discussion was, is the CMO title even relevant in today's world? Right? Because, or should it be a chief digital officer, growth officer, marketing officer combined? And secondly, if you really look at the CMO, is it more of one person or is it more of a network or a system? Right? Because one person to manage all this shift and understand all this shift, no one probably would have that level of experience and almost like a sensitization of the as to how the things are changing. So, what is your thought on that?
Well, I still think that you need one person who's accountable for this.
Right.
So, like the CFO, who is responsible for the financial viability of the organization, I want one person to be in charge of the audience engagement of the organization, the audience
Hmm.
growth. But definitely, they need a team behind them that will support them and allow this integration. And you need
Hmm.
systems to facilitate this. You really need
Hmm.
to design the whole organizational architecture we talked about to facilitate doing this.
Hmm.
And the same thing has to go now, not only at the organization, but also at the board.
Hmm.
So most boards, have a finance committee.
Hmm.
How many boards have a marketing committee?
Yeah.
And if they have the marketing committee is not very effective, no one pays any attention to them. But
Hmm.
what if the marketing committee had the same responsibility as the CFO to be
Hmm.
accountable for the audience growth and engagement of the organization? Wow, suddenly the board, you have now marketing, a voice at the board that pushes toward what we have to do as an organization to engage our customers and get new customers that will be able to help us achieve our vision.
Jerry, another question that I have just gotten is basically about the experimentation, the rapid experimentation, right? So the
Yeah.
question is pretty interesting. So the question is it more of a cultural thing or is it more of a structural thing? It's a great question because is rapid experimentation a cultural aspect or is it more of a structural and just creating uh, or is it both?
I think it's both, and I would add to this: it's a matter of definitely. What I've been arguing always for years has been that all organizations have to have a culture of experimentation. We're really talking about adaptive experimentation. We're not talking about a single experiment. We're talking about the leading companies, what the Google and Amazon and all of the other kind of successful technology company are doing. Continuous experimentation. Everything you do, experiment, experiment, experiment. Because the best way to learn, and fast prototyping, that's what we need. We don't need 7 years in the lab out there. If you can develop a fast prototype, test it and see what the reaction. So the first one will not be perfect, but at least you learn, you get the feedback, and you get a more realistic way of proceeding. So I think that it's definitely a matter of culture, but to make it happen, you also have to have the structure, you have the competencies. I think every organization should hire at least one statistician with expertise in experimental design. Can be from statistics or from experimental psychology, but you need at least one person who really understands experimental design and understands how to design experiments effectively with the right control and how to measure covariates in terms of other variables that may affect the results, so you really interpret the results in an effective way. And it requires the technology many times. It requires a way of almost thinking about the whole measurement, because key to experimentation is measurement. So it has implication to all of the aspects of organizational architecture. But I think you're right. The culture is at the core. And this goes back to leadership. What is, kind of to what extent the leaders of the organization can instill this culture of experimentation in a simple way. I will not, if I was an executive in the company, I will not approve any budget if the budget did not include in it explicitly suggestion for experimentation. Because if you're not having it, you're telling me you're not interested in learning. And the only way of learning is through experimentation. So I would have insisted, if I were an executive in the company, I would have insisted for every budget that you want me to approve, I would like to see at least 3 experiments, one for Horizon 1, Horizon 2, and Horizon 3, or if Horizon 3 is too difficult, so at least for Horizon 1 and 2.
Great point, Jerry. You, again, sort of getting back to this point about experimentation, I mean, we have seen that it's so extremely important to empower all the team members, but more so the team members who really are having those interactions directly with the customer. And that becomes an extremely important component, right? So from that perspective, are we really looking at maybe making any changes to the org structure rather than the hierarchical classic basis, whereby by the time you sort of get to know as to what the call center guy really sort of heard, probably it's lost in translation, right? So are we looking at re-architecting the entire organizational structure to make it a lot more customer-centric, or how would you think about that?
Absolutely. I would start by saying the customer has to be at the center. And if given the fact that I have to understand the customer and ideally collaborate with the customer, co-creating with the customer, what are the implications for the rest of the organization? There is, in the book, we're talking about development, and we're suggesting that the development should be front to back. So the idea is you want to start the development, not at the back office with the product, here's the product, and then how do I sell the product? But the idea will be to start with the front, with the customer. What are the customer needs? And how can I incorporate what are the implications of the customer need to what I have to deliver to try to meet these needs? So put the customer at the center, and the same thing applies not only for the design of the offering, the product and service offering, but also to the organization. How can I develop the organization that will allow us to meet their needs in the most effective way? So it's a great point, and I think that definitely we should encourage organizations to rethink all aspects of organizational architecture, including the structure.
So in this model, the 8 principles you have recommended, Jerry, I'm pretty sure all of them are sort of entwined, right? They basically sort of work with each other.
Right.
So collectively, I mean, how should, if let us say someone who's listening to this presentation or a discussion, I mean, where do they even start? Should they really start thinking of it collectively as one framework, or should we sort of start somewhere, one of these principles?
Ideally, at some point, we should basically address all 8. Ideally. pragmatically, to try to move forward, I would select the one area that is most critical and relevant to my current organizational situation. So let me analyze my current situation,
Hmm.
do a SWOT analysis or whatever. But let's analyze the current situation. What are the real challenges that I face? Identify a major problem that I have, and so okay, to address this problem, which of these principles help me the most, and design experiment around it. Uh,
Hmm.
that's one approach. The other approach is the most fundamental one, which is item number one, which says, let's examine the changes in the world, the changes in technology, in consumers, the consumer behavior, the more empowered and skeptical consumers, the changing competition and the like. And to what extent my current mental and business model are still okay to try to deal with these changes. And if they're not, how should I change my current mental and business model? And start with there. This is the most fundamental of all the areas. And whatever I do, translate immediately into let's design now an experiment so I can move forward and test the idea to what extent it makes sense or not.
Fantastic, Jerry. The final question, and this has been amazing. The final question is, in many cases, the organization starts with one of these points, as you mentioned. But in many cases, it may not really have an immediate impact, or you may not be able to see an immediate outcome, right? And if you really look at some of these pieces like innovate, then experiment, 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 some of these outcomes may really take a fairly long amount of time. One of the things which I keep on sharing with our team, if you remember, Amazon had a search engine called A9. Now, at that point in time, everyone sort of laughed at it and it was gone. But the team kept working at it, and now we all know it as Amazon advertising is really booming. It has become number two in terms of the paid pay-per-click or paid search model after Google. Now, from that perspective, they had to really have the tenacity, and they were able to adapt, customize, understand the customer better, and really integrate so that it has now really giving Google a run for their money. So, from that perspective, what is the time horizon and any pieces of advice for folks who may not really have 10 years, let us say, but as to how exactly do they know as to whether they are on the right track moving forward with this model?
This is such an important and difficult question. Um, Unfortunately, there is no single answer to this. The You identify the problem. You identify the problem, which is that some experiments take longer to materialize. So my suggested solution to this is the obvious one: hire intelligent leaders who have part of their leadership style and skills, the combined ability to move fast, experiment fast, and if it succeeds, scale it big. If it's not, kill it. But move immediately to the next experiment and have more experiments. So kind of to have a whole series of continuous experimentation going on. So you don't depend on a single experiment and waiting for 5 years for the results. So you're running a portfolio of experiments. And I think the solution is by having the kind of the ideal people leading it, but at the same time managing it as a series of experimentation, that some of them will have short-term results because you need reinforcement. You need for the management, you need reinforcement to show that it's working. Because if you're running an experiment, it doesn't work, the inclination could be, okay, forget it. Let's
Exactly.
get rid of it. Let's go back to the old way of doing it. But if you're running a portfolio of experiments, then you have the opportunity here to say, well, this experiment immediately led to the following results, and this experiment will take a little longer. And kind of we start dealing with portfolio of experiments, and experimentation is the responsibility of everyone in the organization. It's not a centralized place that is doing,
Mhm.
few experiments. So you create a culture of experimentation. And I think this will solve the problem because some of them will have a short-term impact, some will have a longer-term impact, but you evaluate this as a portfolio.
Fantastic. Jerry, I know, I mean, I had mentioned the last question, but if it is okay, the audience questions are just sort of flooding in. I'll just have one
Certainly.
last one, and this is the final question. This is from Victor. Victor is the CEO of Redeal. They are a Swedish company. He said, Jerry, thank you very much for this extremely interesting session. These are very interesting times, to say the least. How do you suggest boosting the willingness to experiment and try new solutions at an individual level within the organization?
Uh, I think that the same reward system for everything else you're trying to achieve in the organization, monetarily and non-monetarily. Start featuring the experiments and don't focus only on successful experiments. Create a system, a president's president's award for a weekly reporting or a monthly reporting on innovative experiments, and feature the person who led them, whether successful or not. And the focus is, focus on what would you try to do, what objective, what would you do, what are the results, and most important, what have we learned from this? So by adding the fourth item, which is what have we learned from this, you are then encouraging people, even if the experiment failed, did not lead to the results you wanted. We learned something from this, and what are we doing that is a result of this? What will be the next experiments we'll do? So I think I would start featuring, as part of the culture, can be a, kind of a weekly, monthly, bi-weekly, whatever the time period, depending how many experiments you can run. And I would like to do it weekly because this will suggest more experiments are being run, to reward, to recognize it, to empower them, to present, and then to reward them, kind of clearly monetarily and promotion-wise, and in the promotion to recognize that this is because of their innovativeness in coming up with innovative experiments and initiating them and carrying them through.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jerry. We could have continued for a very long time. Really appreciate your ideas and insights on this thing. Thank you very much, Jerry. Thanks a lot.
You're more than welcome. May I conclude with kind of my last slide?
Absolutely, please.
If we can put the last slide on.
Yeah, I think you can change the last slide, Jerry.
Yeah, reflect. Whoops, we move back. My last slide is reflections and takeaways. So I would like to suggest to the audience, if you take 30 seconds while we are transitioning to the next speaker, and jot down to yourself, what are you going to do differently as a result of my talk, and especially most interesting discussion with Udain? And what will you do? What type of experiments would you do? So write down to yourself a real action plan as a result of this session. And hopefully as a result of the day, when you have a few more kind of exciting talks coming and discussion, you'll be able to identify at the end of the day an experiment or two that you would like to run based on the lessons from all of the sessions that you are attending. And thanks so much for inviting me, and hopefully this was helpful.